Well, it is time now to take a step back and look at the spring sitting of Parliament. What were the big issues? How did the MPs that you elected deal with them? What was handled well? And which files were fumbled? And where do things go from here? To look at it all, I'm joined by three avid federal political watchers. Bob Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail. Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. And Joanna Smith is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press. All three of you, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, now attach your seatbelts because we have so much to cover. Let's start with the issue that sort of rounded out the year. The last question period, what was front and center in the last question period in the House was these allegations or accusations from a Nova Scotia RCMP superintendent saying that he and his colleagues had come under pressure from RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki to release information on the weapons which were used in the mass shooting in 2020. And he says that the commissioner referred to the federal government's upcoming gun legislation, that she made commitments to have that information released. Just to set the record, the public safety minister from the time, Bill Blair, has denied that there was any federal interference. The Prime Minister has said that there was no, quote, undue pressure exerted. Commissioner Lucki of the RCMP has said she, quote, did not interfere in the investigation. Briefly, where do you think this is all headed? How serious is this, Bob?
Look, I think it's very serious. There does appear to be, from Superintendent Darren Campbell's notes, an attempt by the Commissioner of the RCMP to ask the police to compromise their investigation to help the Liberals' gun agenda. And complicating this is Friday, the news that those 4 pages had been withheld by the Justice Department and only been provided to the government, to the Commission of Inquiry, May 31st, and only released on Tuesday. So this is beginning to smell like they knew that those notes were bad and they didn't really want to release them. And remember this, Mr. Trudeau said during the SNC-Lavalin case there was no undue pressure on Jody Wilson-Raybould. So I think this is very serious. We do need to have those parliamentary hearings. We do need to hear from Commissioner Lucki, who is still has refused to say whether to deny or confirm whether she did in fact tell those officers that she had promised Bill Blair, then the public safety minister, and the Prime Minister's office that she would release those guns so that would help them with their pending gun ban on assault rifles.
Okay. Briefly, Niigaan and Joanna. Niigaan, what do you make of it? What are you watching for?
Well, I mean, we've had a good overview of what's led to the event itself. I mean, during the recent Ontario election, there was overwhelming support for the gun bans that the Liberals are seeking to introduce. And that's important because the issue really has to do with a cover-up of pages during an investigation, not so much around the issue itself. Mm-hmm. And that's the key here, which I think is what's giving the issue legs. So the government had better be ready to come out and talk a little bit about those missing pages and how that impacts the investigation, because they've actually got a lot of public support for the gun ban itself. Okay, Joanne, thoughts on this? I know the Public Safety Committee has said that it's going to be hearing from some of the key actors in all of this, the Commons Public Safety Committee.
I think the interesting thing that came out yesterday was when Trudeau was asked whether he has confidence in Commissioner Lucki. He said he does, but then when asked whether she acted appropriately, he referred back to her own statement and sort of left her to speak for herself. Her statement was really interesting in that it sort of noted that she would have done things differently in that meeting and how she conveyed that information to the Nova Scotia RCMP. So I think that will be a key thing to watch going forward.
Okay, let's look at that was an issue that dominated the last days of Parliament. What would you say briefly is the biggest issue of the whole spring sitting? Start with you, Bob.
Look, I think it has to be the economy. You know, we've seen inflation spike up to nearly 8%. Although there's a lot of people working, there are big problems in terms of supply chains. There's big problems in terms of getting enough workers. We've got a 1 million plus backlog of people coming into the country, which we need for the workforce. But largely it's inflation and how the government is handling this. Now, it's a global phenomenon. It's not just isolated only to Canada. But the government, this is going to be not only the problem, I think, facing the government this spring, and as you know, it dominated question periods with the Conservatives and the NDP talking about how the government is going to deal with inflation and whether they should be, cutting gas prices or cutting the carbon tax to help people. This is going to be something that's going to be dominating, I think, for the rest of the year and probably into next year as well, because inflation is not going to come down very soon, and this is going to lead to wage spirals and all of those kind of awful things that people of my generation remember from the 1980s and early 1990s when inflation was out of control. So it's a serious issue that affects Canadians, but it's also going to have an effect on the government and their popularity with Canadians if they can't handle it properly.
Okay, Niigaan, what would you elect as the biggest issue this spring?
Well, my first one was around the economy, but just a reminder that 45% of Canadians poll came out today to say that they feel that the situation is worse than 1 year ago, and so certainly the issue of inflation, the economy is on Canadians' minds at the moment. However, I do believe it's coming back sooner than expected, and most people within the Bank of Canada are suggesting that. But if I were to pick another issue that would be very close, of course, it's the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine is the impetus around much of this inflation. It has certainly sped it up in lots of different ways. And, right here in Manitoba, we are the largest population of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine. It is a crucial issue that's facing people along here on the prairies. It's talked about every day. And the fact that right now the war is definitely turning in the favor of Russia. There are 100 to 200 Ukrainians being killed every day, around 500 being wounded every day. That is a much different situation than what was happening on the early stages of the war. As the globe, the world turns its attention more to its own internal issues around the economy, it's turning away from Ukraine. And the fact that this is something that Canada has to continue to keep supporting, keep on the national agenda. It's something that I think many politicians are bringing up constantly, time and time again, that Ukraine is something Canada can't forget.
Okay, Joanna, your nomination for what you consider the biggest issue.
I also chose the war in Ukraine, not just for what it's doing domestically to the economy, but also just larger around the world and where the world is headed. I remember the day that Russia did launch its invasion, we asked Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, could this mean the end of the post-war order? And I remember her answer kind of chilling me, where she said it could be, right? And there are absolutely other conflicts around the world. And I think we need, as Canadians, to think critically about why this one resonates so strongly on both an individual and societal level. I think that has informed the way Canada has responded to the Ukrainian refugee crisis, coming up with very creative ways to get people here very quickly they have not done for other conflicts. But it does resonate. It is affecting inflation. It's affecting the price of everything. It's affecting stability. And yet it's one of those things where Canada's really tied in its ability to do much about it. They've brought in sanctions. There's some evidence that they are having some effect. They've sent military aid. And yet the risk of NATO entering an actual war with Russia is one reason that no one's bringing in a no-fly zone, which is one thing Ukraine had asked for early on to end things. So it is something that is continuing and will continue to cause a lot of disruption in Canada and the world. Okay,
I want to turn to the most poorly handled issue this spring. What did the government have difficulty with? What did it botch? Bob?
Well, for my mind, it's Afghanistan. I've been doing a lot of stories on Afghanistan. I've been talking to people in Afghanistan who had worked for Canada's military and diplomatic mission there. Many of these people, thousands of these people, had submitted applications to the Immigration Department and have still not received any reply. And they are in hiding, and they are frightened for their lives, and it is heartbreaking to talk to them on the phone. They worked either as security guards or for Canadian aid agencies or as interpreters. Mm-hmm. Now, Canada has done a decent job in some ways of bringing at least 16,000 out, and they recently have made efforts to facilitate the removal of the rescue of people who are in Afghanistan who were who have gotten their approvals from the Canadian government, and Pakistan has helped by restoring transit visas. So several thousand people are now going to get out, but there are so many other people that have still not got their approvals, and they are so frightened. And, we have an obligation to these people. It's just heartbreaking when you have them on the phone or on WhatsApp and they're crying and they're in hiding. And I think that the government has done a great job in Ukraine. They moved mountains to help the Ukrainians come to this country as temporary residents. Surely we can do the same thing for Afghanistan.
Okay, I want to move quickly through this. Niigaan, if you had to choose one thing that was really, really bedeviled the government, something that was badly handled, what would it be?
I would pick something that's actually impacted all of the parties, particularly the two leading parties, and it's the Freedom Convoy, the handling of the Freedom Convoy issue, and the fact that it was paralyzed Ottawa for weeks. It created a very divisive situation, which was between the governing Liberals and a segment of Canadians that feels disenfranchised and feel quite opposition to the policies. I think that was a direct result to some of the hard lines that we're taking during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the Conservative Party, which has a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde relationship with the Freedom Convoy, particularly in the leadership campaign, in that there seems to be no universal agreement among Conservatives of whether they are Freedom Convoy supporters or not. Mm-hmm. And you really saw that during the time in which those in Ottawa were occupying that space. I mean, it was a colossal disaster for, I think, all parties involved, and particularly the city of Ottawa. But it was also an issue, I think, in which Canadians got to see people just outright flout and ignore the law and generally not get any consequences as a result. I mean, it was a situation and a movement that was funded predominantly by Americans, and Americans on their hard right, and it created a huge divisive situation in this country that parties just weren't able to handle. Okay, I want to, Joanne, I want to ask you, and I know we've alluded to it, but I think this is your choice in terms of the worst handled issue.
Yeah, I chose inflation, and not in the sense that it's within the government's control. As Bob was saying earlier, this is happening on a global scale, and of course, as we know, it's really the Bank of Canada's job to set the direction and keep a target inflation. And they've come under heavy criticism for that, and now they're having to correct things rather aggressively, which is bringing, I think, an additional layer of pain to some people when we think about rising interest rates. But it's and that's allowed people like Pierre Poilievre, for example, to go after the Bank of Canada's governor and the Liberal government in a way that I think resonates with people, even if it is potentially walking a dangerous line. It's one thing for governments and economists and banks to understand this. I think it can be really hard to understand these larger global forces at play and the role the war is playing in this when people are trying to pay for their groceries. And I think what may be missing from the Liberal government is that sort of Bill Clinton, I feel your pain response. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, she made this speech where she talked about government measures to respond to inflation. She talked about nearly $9 billion in financial supports introduced by the government. But those were things that were already in play. They were in the budgets for the past couple of years. So I think it's a bit of a hard spin to sell it as a direct response to something that's happening now. And, they pointed to childcare reduction, fees reduction as part of the answer. And that will help a lot of people, but it is also a larger legacy project they were already planning to do. And I just think there's a lot of anger in the world right now, and people are trying to figure out where to direct it at. It's being channeled by the Conservatives in ways that Niigaan was mentioning during the Freedom Convoy. It might come back to bite them too, frankly, harnessing that energy. So I just really think it's a tough one for all parties to figure out how to handle.
We are running out of time, so I'm going to get you to give me short answers for this then, because we're rapidly running out of time. I'm going to stay with you, Joanna. If we look at another issue, and that is the most undercovered issue, an issue that could have been better covered or more covered, just quickly in a few words.
I would say the opioids crisis. Since 2016, some 29,000 people have died. There's some evidence to suggest it's getting worse under the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in addition to being a human tragedy, it's also a politically fascinating one in terms of where British Columbia is headed on decriminalization. And it'll be interesting to watch to see whether that plays out across Canada as well.
Okay, Niigaan, for an undercovered issue, what would it be?
I think Canadians generally aren't hearing of how this is the first time in 4 years we have stability in the federal government because of the confidence and supply agreement between the NDP and the Liberals. I think that we don't often talk about the use of minority parliaments, or we think of them as bad and we think of them as not useful. But we've got two major bills that came through, the Broadcasting Act and the National Dental Care Program. And of course, not to mention the child care with the agreement with the provinces. I mean, all of these things come from when parties work together. And I think it's sometimes important for us as media to tell the public this is because people are working together across partisan lines and getting things done. And so this is coming from an agreement within a minority parliament. Okay,
Bob, an undercovered issue, in a few words, what would it be?
Okay, notwithstanding the NDP Liberal deal, to me, my biggest concern is that I don't think we've done a good enough job covering the Conservative leadership race, because Mr. Trudeau is not a very popular figure. They've screwed up a lot of files, and if the Conservatives elect a populist Trump-like person and they win power, that's not going to be good for this country. So I think we need to have I would like to see the media have a better understanding of what is actually happening out there on the ground. Is Pierre Poilievre, as we believe, really the front runner, or are the Conservatives, mainline Conservatives, really thinking that this guy is the guy who could be the next Prime Minister? I don't know that, and I think I'd love us to be able to get a little more meat on that to find out what's actually going on the ground amongst Conservatives.
Okay, I want to ask you a question. This is one that's always interesting. The MP or the minister from from any party or from either side of the aisle, an MP or a minister who caught your attention, who impressed you in this spring sitting. Start with you, Bob.
I'm going to be nonpartisan here, so I want to pick Raquel Dancho, who is the public safety critic for the Conservatives, and Heather McPherson, who's the NDP foreign affairs critic. Both of them are very strong performers. They know their facts. They're good on television. They're good in interviews, and they're up-and-coming stars, it seems to me.
All right. Niigaan, who impressed you in this spring sitting?
I'm going to pick Mark Miller. I think oftentimes ministers of Indigenous Affairs, the two that we have now, they don't get a lot of credit. And certainly when they're doing well, you don't hear about it because it's like being perhaps a hockey referee. It's best when you don't notice them. So I'll pick out Mark Miller for this one. I mean, we had just a recent agreement, $1.3 billion with the Siksika Nation, settling 46,000 hectares. That took decades to solve, and it took Mark Miller to bring it over the finish line, not to mention all the other issues. I mean, think about how the issues of unmarked graves have been handled and how it is not as much an issue that's been contentious among Canadians. Generally, people have come to an understanding with that issue, as well as the fact that 1 year ago, people were pulling down statues and marching in the streets. And here we are this year in a much different conversation. And I think it's in large part to the humility, the listening abilities of Mark Miller, in which he's been able to bring things really not in the same, we haven't seen this kind of thing since the days of Jane Philpott. Jane Philpott was also very popular amongst Indigenous peoples as well.
Last words, literally we only have about 15 seconds. Joanna, who would you choose? Who impressed you this sitting?
Defense Minister Anita Anand. I think it was expected she'd do better than her predecessor on the sexual misconduct in the military file, but she also had a war land in her lap. And it was interesting to see her come out ahead of the budget and say that she was pushing for much higher spends. Asterisk on that, she didn't quite get it. And there's still lots that remains to be proven, but I think she has stood out not just on the sexual misconduct in the military file, but also the handling of the war in Ukraine.
Okay, all three of you, I want to thank you. We covered a lot of ground, and there's always a lot, and we will no doubt have a chance to talk about the year to come as well at some point. I want to thank all three of you, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Yeah, miigwech. Thank you so much.
Thank you.